The mountaineer Sir Edmund Hillary once said, "Men do not decide to become extraordinary. They decide to accomplish extraordinary things." Hillary, of course, was the first person to reach the summit of Mount Everest in 1953. He knew a bit, or a lot rather, about what it meant to push yourself to the limit. He knew what it meant to reach your absolute breaking point and then some. And at this breaking point is where Donald Crowhurst found himself in 1969, alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was competing in the Sunday Times Golden Globe race, which was a solo non-stop round-the-world yacht race. Furiously scratching away in his journal, he would try and make sense of the events that had unfolded during the last few years of his life. What was to come of the race and the ambitious businessman from Bridgwater perplexed the world then, and continues to leave people scratching their heads to this day. I'm Bradley Hall, and you're listening to episode 11 of Beyond the Harbor. All he needed was to borrow a yacht for a few months to sail around the world. No big deal, right? But the local committee he pitched to wouldn't budge. It didn't stop him, though. He was just going to have to build his own. But this required a lot of money he did not have. Again, this wasn't going to slow him down. He would pester and beg for the money from local businessman Stanley Best to give him the money he needed. Persuasion and passion. I suppose at this point, I would have probably cut my losses. But those words were not in Crowhurst's vocabulary. He was entering that race one way or another. Stanley Best would eventually give in and give him the loan he needed to build his fast, stable trimaran to sail in the race. Stanley and Donald were not strangers. Best had previously invested in Crowhurst's business, Electron Utilization, in 1962 when it was getting off the ground. The company was rooted in his love for sailing, so that's where all of his energy went. He designed and built a radio direction finder that he called the Navigator. It was a handheld device that allowed the user to take bearings on marine and aviation radio beacons to identify their current position. He assured Stanley Best that this would only be a temporary lean until the money would start rolling in. He had some early success in his business venture, but things started to go a little sideways over the years. In March of 1968, he saw a local newspaper, the Sunday Times, promoting a Golden Globe race, and he sparked an idea. The Sunday Times Golden Globe race was inspired by Francis Chichester's successful solo round-the-world voyage on a yacht, only stopping briefly in Sydney, Australia. The publicity his achievement received birthed a new competition, except this time, it would be non-stop. The idea Crowhurst had would bring his business back from the grave and to the forefront of many new sailors. Though he was just an amateur, he knew this was a last-ditch effort to save his sinking business. He mortgaged both his business and home along with Best's continued support. This would place him in a dire financial situation to where winning would be his only option to save everything. The prize for winning the race was 5,000 British pounds. Granted, it doesn't sound like much, but in today's currency, that equates to roughly 80,000 pounds. The prize would be more than enough to pay off his debts and save his failing business. He would be up against 8 other competitors, chasing the title of first person to sail around the world non-stop. The other sailors consisted of men who were widely known for their abilities to navigate the open ocean, unlike Crowhurst, who was by far the least experienced and the oddball out. The contestants were required to set sail between June 1st and October 31st of 1968, so that they could pass through the Southern Ocean in summertime. So now Crowhurst knew the prize, the goal, and who he was up against, but now he needed an actual vessel to get him across the finish line. In steps his longtime investor, Stanley Best. He gave him the funds to build a 40-foot trimaran. The trimaran was comprised of a main hull and 2 smaller outrigger hulls for stability. They were very popular to sailors at the time due to their ability to avoid capsizing. But in the instance they should turn over, they were virtually impossible to make right again. Knowing this, Crowhurst planned to add an inflatable buoyancy bag on the top of the mast to prevent a potential capsize. It was to be activated by water sensors on the hull designed to detect a potential capsize. His underlying plan, along with everything else going on, was to prove that this invention would help to propel him on the round trip, and on his return he would begin manufacturing and marketing the system. With the outstanding loan due to Stanley Best, he had to offer up his company as collateral should the plan go sideways, thus bankrupting his company. Crowhurst had everything on the line, and the clock was ticking. Time was becoming a huge limiting factor for him though. In a rush to complete the install of his safety devices, he was left with no choice but to start the race and attempt the installation on the water. On October 31st in 1968, which was the last day to enter the race, with only hours to go, Crowhurst had no choice but to set his sails and begin. It was only a matter of time until he would find out just how brutal the sea could actually be. In his haste to make sail, he failed to recognize that his jib and staysail halyards were tangled at the top of the mast. This minor inconvenience only kicked off the never-ending start of his troubles to come. After just 2 days at sea, still within sight of land, the screws on his self-steering unit began to fall off. He had no spares to replace them with, so he had to scavenge them off other parts of the vessel to replace them, only adding issues to other areas. A few days after replacing the screws, he had made it halfway across the Bay of Biscay when he discovered the forward compartment of one of his hulls had sprung a leak. It filled up almost completely with seawater from the faulty safety hatch. Other compartments then began to spring leaks, as he had been unsuccessful in getting the correct piping for the bilge pumps. The only other way to relieve the water was to bail it out with buckets. As you can imagine, this would take a lot of time and effort and leave no one to guide the yacht as he trekked south across the Atlantic. 2 weeks had passed by since pulling out of the harbor in Teignmouth when his generator broke down after being soaked from, wait for it, you guessed it, yet another leaking hatch. He wrote in his daily log, quote, "This bloody boat is just falling to pieces due to lack of attention to engineering detail," end quote. He then made a long list of tasks he needed to complete and concluded that his chances of survival, if he continued on, were at best 50-50. At this point, if it were me out there on the sea, I would strongly consider returning to port after all these unfortunate events back to back. But Crowhurst had boxed himself into such a situation that if he were to drop out now, his reputation would be ruined, his business would be bankrupt, and he would lose his estate. Quitting the race at this point was not an option on the table for him, so he kept his head down and continued onward. He soon realized that the estimates he made for the boat's speed were extremely optimistic, to say the least. His calculations were based on an average of 220 miles per day, but in reality, he was only making about half of that. At this point, there was absolutely no way he was going to catch up with the other sailors, much less win either of the prizes of finishing first or having the fastest time. And he knew it. So, as he had done in the past adventures in life, he concocted a plan that maybe could save the day. On December 5th, just after being on the ocean for 5 weeks, he created a fake logbook and began to falsify his positions. To further convince the people back on shore, he listened to forecasts in the areas that he charted and wrote fake commentary like he was living through those conditions as he sailed, though he was essentially still steadily heading south on the Atlantic. He went at great lengths to carry the lies on, fooling everyone. It even went as far as sending in a fake press release stating that he had sailed 243 miles in 24 hours. This would have been a new world record, though in actuality, he had only traveled 160 miles. Possibly a personal best, but nowhere close to the world record mileage that he was claiming. As he slowly made his way south in the Atlantic, his false positions were already rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and entering the Indian Ocean. His position callouts became even more exaggerated, to a point at where it seems as though he may actually have a shot at winning the race outright. In actuality, he had been bobbing around in the Atlantic, hiding out in the same area he had been a few weeks prior when he sent out the false press release. 3 months went by with radio silence, assumed to be because he didn't want radio transmissions picked up by the wrong land station and expose his lies. After the long silence from January to April in 1969, he blamed it on a faulty generator that had become wet again. But he had other important issues he needed to tend to immediately, so he tacked into port in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to fetch materials to fix a hull that started falling apart. He was greeted and logged by the local officials there, but this stop, that would have ended the race for him, went undetected to everyone else. In early April, just off the coast of Buenos Aires, he broke his radio silence with the line, "Heading Digger Ramrez." This was suggesting that he was approaching the Diego Ramirez, which was a small island southwest of Cape Horn in South America. One of the sailors had a moment of madness and dropped out of the race and headed for the island of Tahiti to, quote, save his soul. The challenges the sea posed while alone in the ocean had gotten to him, and he broke. By this point in the race, there were only Crowhurst and 2 other sailors set to finish. On the 22nd of April in 1969, Robin Knox Johnson was the first person to complete the race, and his time was logged. Now there was only 2 sailors left in the race, Donald Crowhurst and Nigel Tetley. Tetley, who was an experienced British naval officer, was coming up the homestretch, appearing to take the prize of the fastest time, even though he would not be the first to finish. However, with Crowhurst's re-emergence, he felt the wind was slowly slipping away from him. He began to push his yacht harder to try and make up the supposed lost ground, when the unthinkable happened. On May 30th, with only 1,100 miles to port, his trimaran broke apart and sank to the bottom of the ocean. He had mere minutes to send out a distress signal and launch his life raft. Fortunately, though, his distress signal was picked up, and he was rescued unscathed. Nevertheless, his race was over. Now there was only 1 sailor left, and his fate was all but sealed. As it appeared that Crowhurst was gaining ground and set to place the best time, something else was gaining ground on Crowhurst himself. With Tetley out of the race, the spotlight quickly shifted to the last remaining contestant. But this was something that he adamantly wanted to avoid. Being a front-runner for the possible fastest time, he knew his logbooks would come under much more scrutiny now that it looked like he had a chance to take home the prize. Behind the scenes, people were already getting suspicious, including the race chairman Francis Chichester. This sent Crowhurst spiraling into a deep and dark mental state, coming to the realization that his whole world was about to come crashing down. He was slowly coming to grips that there would be no way out of this situation, no other way to deceive the race committee. As his deception and web of lies came crashing down on him, he quit sailing his yacht. He allowed it to just drift and follow the current wherever it may take him. Over the course of the next week, he began writing. He completed a perplexing manifesto, if you will, that described how mankind had achieved such an advanced evolutionary state that it could now merge with the cosmos. He said that the only thing that was needed to achieve this was an effort of free will. Clearly, the venture of being alone on the ocean for many months had broken into his emotions and sent him into a dark mental state, one that is hard to even imagine. He had worked himself into such a hole that it was impossible to dig himself out of. That added stress, coupled with being alone in the ocean, was driving him to the point of insanity. I will spare you from the hour of narration of his 25,000-word manifesto and just read you the final page of his log. Quote, "I am what I am. I see the nature of my offense. I will only resign this game if you agree that on the next occasion this game is played, it will be played according to the rules that are devised by my great God, who has revealed at the last to his Son not only the exact nature of the reason for the games, but has also revealed the truth of the way of the ending of the next game. It is finished. It is finished. It is the mercy. I will play this game when I choose. I will resign this game 11-20-40. There is no reason for harmful. And it just tailed off. That was it. He had filled the page with text. He could have turned the page over and continued. But that was it. The very last words of his log were noted on July 1st of 1969 at exactly 11-20-40. With this, it is presumed that Crowhurst then jumped overboard to his death. His race, both the Golden Globe and life, were now finished. Whether by accident or more likely perhaps by personal choice, Donald Crowhurst was no more. On July 10th, 9 days after Crowhurst entered his final message into his log, the Teignmouth Electron was found adrift in a shipping lane by the RMV Picardy. They noted no captain appeared to be at the helm, and after several attempts to make communication, they decided to board the yacht. They found it abandoned and immediately sent out a distress message, which led to an air and sea search in the immediate surrounding of the boat. What was confusing to them was there seemed to be no signs of a possible storm or rogue wave, and everything was neatly left on board, just as Crowhurst had left it. His logbook along with his journal and manifesto were found stored away neatly, just waiting for someone to find them. The subsequent search showed no sign of life and was called off. This news hit the media and began to spread like wildfire. His logbook and journal were turned over to a couple of journalists of the Sunday Times. Nicholas Tomlin and Ron Hall were left to piece together what exactly happened on the yacht, and the world was waiting for their answers, and they would deliver. They published a book in 1970 with the full story of Donald Crowhurst titled The Strange Story of Donald Crowhurst. Of course, if you are intrigued by this story, I highly recommend picking up the book. It's a solid read, and it goes into a lot more detail inside the mind and feelings Crowhurst was going through alone on the sea. In the book, they write, quote, "Previously, we knew little about the personality of Crowhurst. As we investigated further, it emerged as one of the most extraordinary stories of human aspiration and human failure that, as journalists, we have ever had to record. Although it is basically a story about heroics, there is no hero. But neither is there a villain. Crowhurst, despite his deceptions, was a man of courage and intelligence, who acted as he did because of intolerable circumstances. The fact that he paid a far greater penalty than he need is a testament to his quality." End quote. In 2018, a movie titled The Mercy hit theaters. It followed along on the journey of Crowhurst and his wife during his 7 months at sea. Though I have yet to see it as not to influence the story with Hollywood drama, it is on my watch list as it has pretty good reviews. The director of the film, James Marsh, had this to say about Donald Crowhurst, quote, "He made a pretty good go at sailing around the world. He stayed out in the ocean for the best part of 7 months, so all in all, he achieved much more than people ever thought he could. He just didn't achieve what his objective was. It was a case of overreach. It was hubris, and that is what caused the tragedy of his demise." Over the years, the general consensus of Crowhurst has varied widely, from people thinking he was a deceiver who came to a pathetic and just end, to some believing he was a tortured soul in an involuntary exile from the stable world. I will abstain from giving my personal opinion and remain an unbiased writer. However, what I will say is that a limited amount of people in the world know how cruel the conditions of sailing on the ocean can be, and even fewer people experience the trials of sailing while alone. Donald Crowhurst was exposed to this lonely realm for 7 whole months, with an unbearable amount of stress weighing on his shoulders. Though we might not all be able to agree with some of the decisions he made, I think we can all admit that the end of the story was nothing less of a tragedy, as he left behind his wife and 4 children to make sense of the turmoil that followed. After the race, the winner Robin Knox Johnson donated his £5,000 reward money to Crowhurst's widow Claire and her 4 children. Nigel Tetley was awarded a consolation prize for his efforts in the race, as he was set to become the actual runner-up before his yacht broke apart and sank in the Atlantic. He used the funds to build him yet another trimaran. As for Crowhurst trimaran, it was taken to Jamaica and sold several times. It was refitted and became a cruise boat in Montego Bay, and then went on to serve as a dive boat in the Caymans. Currently, what remains of the vessel still lies decaying to time and the elements on the dunes of the southwest shore of the Cayman Islands. Donald Crowhurst and the struggle he faced, not just during the Golden Globe race, but all throughout his life to find his path, is something we can all face at times. His drive to succeed was fierce, and his determination was unmatched. But as for anyone who has taken to the sea and sailed out of the sight of dry land, knows the ocean has a certain mystique about magnifying the struggles we have within. Maybe, perhaps, there is a little piece of Donald Crowhurst within us too. This episode was written and produced by me, Bradley Hall. If you enjoyed this story as we explore the bizarre tragedy of Donald Crowhurst, please be sure to like, rate, and subscribe. My website and socials are linked in the show notes for you to leave feedback and recommendations. Full transcripts, along with the source material used for this episode, can be found on my website. Thanks for listening.